My name is Ben Covington, and I have been building fine furniture for 15 years, and today I want to introduce you to a very exciting and versatile woodworking machine. It's called the Multi-Router, and it's capable of executing more joints and other tough woodworking challenges more safely, more rapidly, and more perfectly than anything I have ever seen. For the purposes of these demonstrations, we will remove our chip deflector. However, you should always leave your chip deflector installed. As you can see with the Multi-Router, your stock is clamped firmly in place on the work table while your hands control its movement from any of three handles, keeping your hands and face well away from the cutting tool. The Multi-Router was precision designed by a woodworker to safely and quickly achieve mortise and tenons, dovetails, box joints, and more, and all within a few thousandths of an inch in accuracy. Among the Multi-Router's many features are its cast aluminum structure, Thompson rods, Thompson bearings, and a work plane which can be angled for beveling. The work plane can be moved vertically on its Z-axis, in and out on its X-axis, and side to side on its Y-axis. This feature requires your hands stay on the handles as you fluidly glide your stock into the cutting tool. For those of you familiar with the frustrations and dangers of woodworking, you can probably imagine the many functions the Multi-Router was designed to perform. The ability to perform in seconds tasks that normally take minutes, the ability to perform them safely, and the ability through unprecedented accuracy to create the snuggest joints you have ever made. This is what the Multi-Router is about. I hope I have sparked your imagination, because truly the only limits you will find with the Multi-Router are the limits of your creativity. To get you started though, I'm going to run through 4 jobs that you can accomplish with the Multi-Router, along with tips for safety, accuracy, and efficiency. First of all, always leave the Multi-Router unplugged while setting up a job. Only after all of your adjustments are made and you're ready to go should you plug in. The first job I'm going to do today is a mortise. First, insert a 3/8 inch cutter in your router and make sure it extends at least 1 1/4 inch from the vertical surface, here. Once you have selected your stock, mark it to indicate the length and the depth of the mortise you wish to cut. Loosen this knob so that the work surface can move smoothly on the X-axis, and slide this table away from the vertical table so that these template screws can be removed. This allows the 2 planes closer access without the possibility of damaging the screws. Use these white locator pins to set your stock, then clamp it in place. Now it's time to fix all of our settings. First, move the X-axis table toward the Z-axis table, making sure that the cutting tool glides over the top of the stock. Move the X-axis table until the tip of the cutting tool matches the depth marker on the stock. While maintaining that position, move the X-axis stop collar to meet the X-axis bearing housing and tighten the knob. Now lower the vertical slide until the cutter just touches the top of the stock, and tighten this knob to lock the vertical slide. Next, you want to loosen the scale on the side here and adjust it to an even measurement. By doing this, it is much easier to read the measurements and calculate increments. Now we want to get the cutter vertically centered on the stock. First, take 1/2 the diameter of the cutting tool and 1/2 the thickness of the stock and add these together. For example, here we are using a 3/8 cutting tool and a 3/4 inch piece of stock. 1/2 of 3/8 is 3/16, and 1/2 of 3/4 is 3/8. Therefore, we add together 3/16 and 3/8, and we get 9/16. Now, loosen this knob so we can move the X-axis table away from the vertical plane. Then loosen this knob and lower the vertical slide 9/16 using the scale to measure. Now lock it in place by tightening the knob. Now move both vertical stop collars to touch the bearing housing. The stock is now centered. Next, move the X-axis in until the tip of the cutting tool touches the edge of the stock, and loosen this knob, allowing the Y-axis table to move freely. Move the Y-axis table away from you until the cutting tool is aligned with the end marking for the mortise. Slide the Y-axis stop collar in from the far side until it touches the bearing housing and tighten it. Now, move the Y-axis table towards you until the cutting tool is aligned with the other end of the mortise marking. Then slide the other Y-axis stop collar away from you until it is touching the Y-axis table and tighten it. The mortise is now adjusted and fixed on the multi-router. Making sure that the cutter is clear of the stock, you can now put on your safety gear, including safety glasses and hearing protection. Plug the router into an electrical outlet and switch on the motor. With your hands on the handles, move the cutting tool to the far end of the mortise markings and plunge the cutter in all the way using the X-axis handle and steadying the table with the Y-axis handle. Exit the cutter and move the cutter to the near end of the mortise markings. Again, plunge the cutter in all the way and exit the cutter. Finally, move the cutter slowly along the edge of the stock with the Y-axis handle while using the X-axis handle to move the cutter into the stock at 1/8 inch increments until the mortise is completed. What we are left with is a perfect mortise in no time at all. Two additional features of the multi-router can be very useful in cutting mortises. One is this adjustable stop rod, which can be inserted in either side of the XY axis table. When the locator pins can't be used, this auxiliary fence can be raised or lowered by loosening these two screws. Now that we have demonstrated how to make a mortise on the multi-router, the next logical step is to demonstrate the different kinds of tenons that we can make on this amazing piece of equipment. All tenons are designed to be cut with a 1/2 inch cutter, so install the correct cutter, making sure it extends at least 1 1/4 inch from the vertical slide surface. For this demonstration, we're going to make a 3/8 inch tenon. It should be noted here that the multi-router uses two types of templates. The first type are these templates which are made with a track for the stylus. When your cutting tools are machined with extreme accuracy, these templates will work very well because the cutter will cut the stock to exact dimensions as it emulates the path of the stylus through the track. However, if the cutter is slightly undersized, it will not cut the tenon closely enough, making for too snug a fit in the mortise or no fit at all. This other style of template is better suited for cutting tenons with undersized cutting tools. With this kind of template, the stylus must follow the outer edge of the tenon form on the template in order to exactly duplicate its shape. Now let's continue with the tenon. First, attach the appropriate 3/8 inch tenon template to the multi-router by using the Allen wrench and 2 shoulder screws. Select your stock and mark the desired length for the tenon. Now, mark the center line for the tenon on top of the stock. Loosen this knob so you can move the X-axis table, placing the template 3/4 of an inch away from the vertical slide. Now, temporarily tighten that knob. Place the stylus probe into the vertical slide at the top of the template. Position the stock onto the work surface, flush against the vertical slide, making sure that the center line on the stock matches the center line on the work surface. Clamp the stock firmly into that position. With the cutter touching the top surface of the stock, loosen the knobs that hold the scale on the side here, and again, adjust the scale so that it sits on an even measurement for easier calculations. Now, loosen this knob and move the x-axis table with stock attached just beyond the end of the cutter. Retighten the knob temporarily. Next, use this formula for calculating the proper offset dimension for centering the tenon. We want to divide by 2 the difference between the width of the stock and the size of the tenon. In this case, we are subtracting a 3/8 inch tenon from a 3/4 inch piece of stock, and we are left with 3/8 of an inch. 3/8 of an inch divided by 2 equals 3/16. Now, loosen this knob and lower the vertical slide and cutter 3/16 on the scale. Temporarily retighten the knob. Use these knobs to adjust the stylus probe so that the stylus bearing is resting on top of the center portion of the tenon template. Retighten only this knob. Loosen this knob so that the vertical slide can glide up, allowing the cutting tool to clear the stock by about 1 inch. Do not tighten this knob. Now, lower the stop collar to rest on the bearing housing and tighten this knob. Loosen this knob again and move the x-axis table until the tip of the cutter is aligned with the tenon depth mark. Retighten the knob. Also, move the x-axis stop collar against the bearing housing and tighten this knob. This move will also position the stylus probe to the correct depth. Tighten the stylus probe with this knob. Your tenon is now centered and ready to cut. Move your y-axis stop collars out of the way and loosen this knob to allow the y-axis table to move freely. Plug in your router, put on your safety glasses and hearing protection, and now switch the router on. Place your left hand on the z-axis handle and your right hand on the y-axis handle. Move the stylus through the template to cut the tenon. To produce a series of tenons, attach a wooden auxiliary fence. Once again, I think you can see how much of an improvement this method of making tenons is over anything else. The next joint I want to demonstrate on the multi-router is the box joint. To make a 3/8 inch box joint, first select your stock and mark the length of the fingers you wish to make. Mark the top and the outside of the stock like this. Next, attach the box joint template to the multi-router using the Allen wrench and 2 shoulder screws like this. With the router disconnected, insert a 3/8 inch cutter in the router, making sure that the cutter extends between 3/4 and 1 inch beyond the vertical slide surface. Move the x-axis table so that the template is 3/4 of an inch from the vertical slide surface. Tighten the knob temporarily. Position the stylus probe into the first vertical slot of the template. Now, tighten this knob temporarily. Place the stock on the work surface with the end of the stock flush and square with the vertical slide, and with the side edge of the stock against the cutter like this. Clamp the stock in place and install the auxiliary wooden fence. Loosen these 2 knobs and move the X and Z axis tables so that the cutter end lines up with the box joint finger depth mark. Now retighten this knob. Move the stop collar against the X-axis bearing housing and tighten. And readjust the stylus probe to touch the template. Raise the vertical slide until the stylus probe clears the top template by 1 inch. Lower the top stop against the vertical slide bearing housing and retighten this knob. And now, put on your safety gear, including safety glasses and hearing protection. Plug the router in and switch the power on. Grasp the Z-axis handle with the left hand and the Y-axis handle with the right hand. Move the stylus into the first slot in the template and make the cut. Raise the Z-axis and stylus out of the slot and move the stylus into the next slot for the second cut. Repeat the sequence until all cuts are made. Switch off the router. Remove the first piece of stock and place the second piece of stock on the table. Switch the router on and follow the same process of cutting as with the first piece of stock. And here is our completed box joint, snug and perfect. And now, I want to demonstrate a fourth joint, the dovetail joint. But before I do, I would like to remind you that these are only a few of the joints that can be made with the multi-router. Be creative. After all, the multi-router is a very versatile and safe machine. All right, our first step in making a dovetail joint is to make sure that the router is switched off and unplugged. Next, install a 14-degree half-inch dovetail bit. Make sure that the router is firmly tightened in its housing and that the cutter extends completely through the vertical slide surface. Now, select your stock and mark the desired length of the tails and the center line on top of the stock. Attach the tail template to the multi-router using the Allen wrench and 2 shoulder screws. With the multi-router, the tail should always be cut first. Loosen this knob and position the X-axis table so that the template is 3/4 of an inch away from the vertical slide. Temporarily tighten this knob and move the Y-axis table until the stylus probe lines up with a vertical slot near the center of the template. Temporarily tighten the knob. Position your stock onto the work surface flush against the vertical slide with the center lines matching up. Clamp the stock firmly into place. Be especially sure that the clamps are firmly seated into their holes. You will want to attach the auxiliary wood fence for common dovetail, pin, and tail setups. Now loosen these knobs and move the X and Z-axis tables so that the end of the cutter lines up with the dovetail length mark. Retighten this knob and move the stop collar against the X-axis bearing housing and tighten this knob. Adjust the stylus probe until the stylus bearing just touches the template surface. Raise the vertical slide until the stylus probe clears the top of the template slide.